Welcome once again to Along the Rio Grande. I'm George Torak, and today we'll be visiting two interesting sites in the El Paso area, Evergreen Cemetery and the University of Texas at El Paso's Chihuahuan Desert Gardens. We begin with a tour of Evergreen Cemetery with El Paso historian Fred Morales. We're at Evergreen Cemetery, one of El Paso's great historic cemeteries, and we're joined today by Fred Morales, El Paso historian, someone who's done a lot of research over the years on El Paso and has put together a lot of information about Evergreen Cemetery. Welcome to Along the Rio Grande.
I'm glad to be on your program.
Where exactly is Evergreen Cemetery?
Evergreen Cemetery is located in what is now central El Paso at 4301 Alameda. It's right across Washington Park. It spawns 28 acres. It's located south of the SB track to Boone Street, to Alameda and Thomas and Hospital. It encompasses this area.
So this is a fairly large cemetery. How many people are buried here?
The cemetery has over 43,000 people buried. Plus, it also has a mausoleum in the back, which has in the neighborhood of at least 428 crypts. The cemetery got started officially in 1894 when a man by the name of R.H. Thorne started to construct the cemetery. By 1919 was purchased by A.B. Poe. A.B. Poe became a mayor of El Paso, and he was mostly noted for being the first mayor to put the Christmas tree in San Jacinto Plaza. The graves come from all time periods or eras. They cover like people from all walks of life. This is really a cemetery that's a who's who of El Paso. Here we had lawyers, we have physicians, we have gunslingers, we have veterans, we have early settlers of El Paso. We've had people that have been involved in the creating of the city of El Paso.
Could you give us a tour of Evergreen Cemetery today? Maybe show us some of the more historically significant grave sites?
I'll be glad to. Let's start with the Spanish-American War plot.
Sure. What are we going to see in the Spanish-American War section?
We're going to see a lot of veterans that proudly served during the Spanish-American War during the 1890s.
Now, the Spanish-American War, that's a war between the United States and Spain. Most of the fighting took place in Cuba in the late 1890s.
And most of the people were started buried here in the 1930s all the way up to the 1950s. We're talking about at least 50 veterans.
And as people started to pass on in the 1930s, they decided to designate this area of the cemetery specifically for veterans of that conflict. And we have some people all the way up that lived all the way up until the 1970s that are buried here.
There is also other military history here in the cemetery. Why don't we go take a look at the Civil War plot?
Okay. We're in the Civil War area of the cemetery. How many Civil War veterans do we have here?
We're talking about at least 50 Civil War veterans.
Most of them on the Confederate side?
Yes, the majority of them.
Do we have any important El Pasoans that were Civil War veterans? Anybody famous?
Yes, the most notable is Parker Burnham. He was very well known for bringing the mail from San Antonio to El Paso and then to Santa Fe. He worked with Henry Skillman, and he was very well known by the Indians that roamed the area. He worked on the Jackass line of the stagecoach.
So he was involved in some of the early mail delivery on the stage routes?
Yes.
And then he goes off and fights in the Civil War?
Right.
And he comes back to El Paso afterwards?
He comes back and he decides that after working with the Mexican Central Railroad that he wants to be buried along the foothills of El Paso. And that's why he's buried here.
When did this area become designated as a Civil War section?
In 1919, the United Daughters of the Confederacy erected this monument to the Civil War veterans. And since then, it has been very well maintained, and they still have this plot in the cemetery.
Are there other military sections of Evergreen Cemetery?
No, these are the only ones, but they are veterans that served also in other conflicts, including World War I, that are scattered throughout the cemetery.
What about the Mexican Revolution? I understand that there's some people here that were involved in the revolutionary conflict of the 19 teens. Are they buried at Evergreen Cemetery as well?
Yes, there's several very well-known people that were involved in that conflict.
Can we
I'd
go
like to
take a
show
look
you.
at them?
Sure.
Sure. Here we have the site of Victoriano Huerta's grave. He certainly played an important role in the Mexican Revolution.
He served for about a year as president of Mexico. After the assassination of Francisco Madero, he took over power as a usurper. After that, he was expelled from Mexico and he went to New York City, and he came towards El Paso and was arrested in Newman, Texas for violation of the neutrality laws. And he was placed under house arrest in a house in Sunset Heights. And there he died of complications due to cirrhosis of the liver. He had a big drinking problem. Pancho Villa nicknamed him El Borrachito. Victoriano eventually died at the old Hotel Du Hospital here in El Paso.
And he was brought to Evergreen Cemetery?
Yes, at first he was buried in a vault in Concordia Cemetery. And in the 1940s, he was transferred here.
Now, we have a number of other notable people that played a role in the Mexican Revolution that are buried here at Evergreen. Who are they?
The others are mostly people that took a lot of photographs and postcards of the revolution. I'd like to show you Casasola and Horn.
Okay. Now, this is the gravesite of Casasola. Who was Mr. Casasola?
Mr. Casasola, along with his brothers, became very much involved in photographing the Mexican Revolution from 1910 to 1919. They produced some of the best volumes of photographs concerning the revolution. After that, he came to El Paso and settled here, and at 511 South El Paso Street, he had his own photography studio, and that became a landmark here in El Paso for many decades. Yeah, so that is someplace over there.
Okay.
In this area, there's a former mayor of El Paso.
Oh, really?
Richard Dudley. There's about, in the neighborhood of about 6 mayors, former mayors of El Paso here in the cemetery. Yeah, that's him.
Dudley, I see. Okay. And here we have Richard Dudley, one of the mayors of El Paso.
Dudley was mayor of El Paso in the 1920s, 1923 to 1925. He ran for mayor on the anti-Ku Klux Klan ticket, which he labeled that organization as a hell-born organization. And he won. And some of the most notable things during his term of office is that he installed the first traffic control system here in El Paso, and he rebuilt the old Stanton Street Bridge out of concrete. He also resided at the old Hoover home on Cincinnati Street in Kern Place.
We're in the Trost section of the cemetery, and of course the most famous of the Trost family is Henry C. Trost.
Henry C. Trost arrived in El Paso in 1904 with his brother William. They came from Ohio, and they started their own business called Trost and Trost. They went on to design over 1,000 structures in the country, including 250 schools. Here in El Paso, Trost was well known for designing El Paso High School, the School of Mines, the old Cortez building, the Paso del Norte Hotel, the Mills building, the White House, the old State National Bank building. Plus, he had his own residence at 1013 West Yandell Street.
Now this is Juan Hart, son of Simeon Hart, one of El Paso's early settlers.
Yes, Juan Hart became the city's engineer in 1881 after being involved in Mexico in surveying a gold mine. After that, he came to El Paso, and in 1882, he became the editor of the El Paso Times. He was known as a person that also got involved in social causes. In particular, he fought for the city of El Paso to try and obtain pure water to get an irrigation system, and he was very much vocal against gambling and prostitution in the 1890s. The Hart family dates back to 1849, the first one being Simeon Hart. They built a grist mill or molino in what is now the present Hacienda Cafe. And one Hart was one of 7 children later born to Simeon.
And this is the Ponsford area of the cemetery. And we have Henry Ponsford, another person that was involved in a lot of building and construction in El Paso.
Ponsford came from Canada in 1897. When he arrived here in El Paso, he opened up his business dedicated to building a lot of structures. Principally, they were mostly schools. Some of them were like Coldwell, Lydia Patterson School, Bowie and Isleta High School. And he also constructed the old original YMCA building that used to be in downtown El Paso. But he's more known for being the contractor that built the old Plaza Theater. Besides that, Ponsford was also involved in building a lot of shops at Phelps Dodge and a lot of housing facilities at Holloman Air Force Base.
We have another person that people in El Paso see his work every day when they're driving along on the freeway. This is the site of the grave of Mr. Urbici Soler.
Yes, Urbici Soler was a Spanish-born sculptor. He dedicated a lot of his life studying in Europe to learn the trade of sculpture. In 1937, he was contracted to do the statue of Mount Cristo Rey. He utilized 4 blocks of Texas sandstone brought in from Austin, Texas, and the job was completed in about 1940. After that, Soler taught at the College of Mines, classes that dealt in art and philosophy. And before he died, he lived at the base of Cristo Rey Mountain, and he was buried here in 1953. And this, I might point out, is the only grave in Evergreen Cemetery that has a historical marker.
We want to thank Fred Morales for showing us around Evergreen Cemetery today. Fred has done extensive research on Evergreen, and he's put together this fascinating guide. We continue today with a tour of the Chihuahuan Desert Gardens, located on the grounds of the Centennial Museum at the University of Texas at El Paso. Our guide is Winn Anderson. We're with Mr. Winn Anderson at the University of Texas at El Paso, and Mr. Anderson is the botanical curator of the Chihuahuan Desert Gardens, and he's joining us today on Along the Rio Grande to tell us a little bit about the desert environment and some of the plants. I understand you've been with the university for quite a while.
George, yes, first of all, let me say welcome. We're glad to have you in the Chihuahuan Desert Gardens here at UTEP. Yes, after almost 35 years of being an administrator, I retired last year and was able to now devote a good portion of my time to the development of the Chihuahuan Desert Gardens.
Maybe we can explain what the Chihuahuan Desert Gardens is briefly before we begin our tour.
Well, it is a mini botanical garden that specializes in the flora of the Chihuahuan Desert, but we do so in a little bit different format. Instead of just rows of plants that would be like in a normal setting for faculty and students, we've chosen to try to display the flora in a landscape setting, and that makes it a resource for the whole community.
So people can come and enjoy the setting as well as it being a learning environment for students or a research environment.
Well, what we'd really like to do is to make sure that people have an opportunity to see that there are some alternatives for landscaping other than rocks and cactus.
Great. This is the Chihuahuan Desert. There's different types of deserts. In our area, I guess the Sonoran Desert and the Chihuahuan Desert would be the ones that people are most familiar with. What are the differences? Because I understand they're very distinct.
Well, the Chihuahuan Desert is what we call a high cool or high cold desert. I like to call it a cool desert because when you compare it to the Great Basin Desert, which the Chihuahuan Desert and the Great Basin Desert are about the same size. Depending on which geographer you talk to, the Chihuahuan Desert is either the largest or the second largest behind the Great Basin. The Great Basin is a cool desert, or a cold desert, I'm sorry. Then there's the Mojavean Desert and the Sonoran Desert, which are low, hot deserts. That means basically that we get a lot more cold temperature than either of those two deserts. And that's why we don't have things like saguaros, for example.
Is there a difference between the cool and the cold, you say?
Yes, the Great Basin Desert, being a cold desert, means that it has a lot more cold-hardy plants. It has very few cactus, very few plants that won't sustain that cold weather they have. So they're rather limited in the diversity of their plants.
If we're driving from El Paso into Arizona, we see some differences in the landscape. What's different about the Sonoran Desert?
The Sonoran Desert is often considered to be more lush than the Chihuahuan Desert, and they do receive more moisture than we do. But frankly, the Chihuahuan Desert is one of the world's greatest, has one of the world's greatest diversity of both plant and animal life. It is a young desert. It is far more, I think, interesting than the Sonoran Desert, the saguaro notwithstanding. The saguaro is often used, you know, as a symbol for the Chihuahuan Desert in El Paso, and that's just ridiculous. We're nowhere near. The nearest saguaro is over near Tucson, a good 400 miles away. Our symbol ought to be the ocotillo and the yucca.
What variety of plants do we find in general?
Well, you mean in the Chihuahuan Desert?
Right.
Oh, you have everything from the riparian habitat along the Rio Grande, the Conchos in Mexico, the Pecos River. Those are the major river drainages of the Chihuahuan Desert, to the mountains. The Chihuahuan Desert is really known for its sky islands. It's often described as a desert, it'd be mountain island and desert seas, which I think is pretty descriptive. The plains, the bolson bottoms have sand dune habitat in this general area. We also have the creosote flats with things like tar bush and creosote bush and turpentine bush and skeleton leaf goldeneye. We have tremendous plants here in the Chihuahuan Desert.
Maybe you can show us some of the variety of plants that we find in the Chihuahua Desert?
I'd be glad to. Right now we're in the terrace garden, which features plants from the eastern part of the Chihuahuan Desert, and particularly the Big Bend region.
Now, desert plants have different strategies or different ways that they survive the desert climate. What's that involve?
Well, there are, as you mentioned, a number of strategies. Drought avoidance are those plants that we like to call it live quick and die young, where they get that winter moisture and come up in the spring, flower, set their seeds, and die before it gets too hot, or wait until our monsoon rains occur in late fall. Then they'll bloom at that time and set their seeds before winter. That's drought avoidance. Drought resistance are plants like this that use a number of strategies simply to resist drought, but do have to have some supplemental water on a regular basis. And then there's drought tolerance, and here's a really good example of a good drought tolerant plant. And the strategies are varied, everything from little tiny leaves so that it loses less moisture through evaporation, to the silver color. Now, actually the leaves on this plant are green, but they're covered with so many tiny little silver hairs, it makes its own shade, reflects the sun, and that cuts down on the loss of moisture.
Now, there's a lot of bees flying around here. Aren't you afraid we're going to get stung?
No, these are bumblebees. The only time you're going to get stung by a bee like that is when you disturb it by trying to pick it up or catch it in your hand. These bees aren't going to bother you at all. As a matter of fact, they're a welcome addition to the gardens. They're good pollinators. We have a number of plants here that are really good for wildlife gardening, and bees are part of that. We have great hummingbird plants. We have a good hummingbird population in the gardens now. Bees are welcome. And this is a good example of a hummingbird plant. This is one of the penstemons, Penstemon barricifolius, from the eastern part of the Chihuahuan Desert. And the hummingbirds just love these long tubular flowers. But in terms of drought tolerance, look at the thick, glossy leaves that the plant has. And here's an even better example. This is a Texas pistache, related to the pistachio, grows in the desert, and it has very shiny, thick, glossy leaves. Well, that's a waxy coating that helps hold the moisture in the leaf so that it doesn't lose that water that's so precious in the desert.
Now, the Native Americans survived off of some of the desert plants. What do we see here?
Well, obviously, they were successful in living in the desert, and they had to use the indigenous plants, but this is one of the more famous ones. This is Phaseolus acutifolia. This is the tepiary bean. This is the bean that was so important to the Native Americans. Here are some dried ones, for example. These beans are quite edible, and they are native. They were made probably most famous by the Pueblo Indians, but they were used by the Indians in this area all across the Southwest. This is a variety called Sonoran Gold that comes from the Pima Indians over in Arizona. But the Tarahumara still grow these beans in Chihuahua today.
Now, what about cactus? How do they survive in the desert environment?
Well, cactus are probably the most efficient at drought tolerance, and they're the classic desert plant. Here, for example, is a claret cup, and you can see the swollen stem. It has no leaves. The stem simply swells like an accordion. It takes up water and holds that moisture in the stem. It also has a waxy coating to cut down on the loss of that moisture. But the other thing I would point out is that there are other plants that are often called cactus, which are not. This, for example, is the giant Faxon yucca from down in Big Bend. This is the lechagia, the agave that is found in the Franklin Mountains. Well, these two plants are not cactus at all.
They're not
actually
part of the
in
cactus family?
That's right.
No?
This is in the amaryllis family, like lilies and the bulbs. Their drought tolerant strategy, though, is to have thick, leathery leaves that hold moisture in the leaves and in the thick trunks. These plants are all the ones that are particularly considered as succulents or semi-succulents and often misnamed as cactus, but includes agaves, sotols, the bear grass, and they all use that similar status, thick, leathery leaves that hold a lot of moisture.
This is the contemplative garden, which would be a good place for us to talk a little bit about water, how water's been overused in the El Paso area and what kind of problems that presents for us. We don't have as much water as we're going to need, do we?
No, our history here has been one of mining water, just like you mine coal out of the fossil deposits in the Hueco and Masilla Bolson. And while those bolsons contain a lot of water and they're not about to run dry, we are running out of potable water. In other words, water that has sufficient lack of minerals that we can drink it. And that is going to cause us some real problems in the next 25 years.
Can't we just take more water out of the river?
Well, again, the river supply is highly regulated. Part of it belongs to New Mexico, part of it belongs to Mexico. Again, there is only so much water. And in dry years, when we don't get the snowpack in Colorado and northern New Mexico, that's going to be stressed as well. We have to learn to start using our water more efficiently.
What could an average person do to save water?
Well, for one thing, converting not to xeriscaping, but converting their gardens by removing the plants that use a lot of water, and that means large expanses of grass, for example, but not all grass, and converting to plants that use a lot less water. And I hope one of the things that we've demonstrated here today is that there are a great number of choices that are just as pretty, just as green, they flower beautifully. We're not talking about rocks and cactus. More efficient use of water also means things like water harvesting. Design your garden so that, as in this case, no water falls on this garden that runs off the site. The walkways, everything are designed to take that water into the beds and be stored in the soil for the use of the plants. Efficient mulches. You notice we use both organic and inorganic mulches in the garden. That helps conserve the moisture in the soil. These are the kinds of things you can do in your landscape. In your home, taking advantage of the low-flow shower heads, the low-flow toilets. We're looking at things like different types of washing machines for clothes laundering, the upright machines that load from the side instead of the old top or tub washers use a lot less water. Simple things like don't leave the hydrant running when you brush your teeth or when you shave. Just use the water wisely.
And all of those little things added up with hundreds of thousands of people over the years makes a difference.
Makes a big difference.
Very big difference. Where can people find out about different types of landscaping or different types of plants?
Well, certainly we hope here at the Chihuahuan Desert Gardens that we'll be providing that resource. As I said, we present the native flora of the Chihuahuan Desert in a series of gardens in a landscape setting. We have signage coming in that should help people learn the names of the plants. But once they do that, they need to go to their favorite nursery and say, I want native plants. I want drought-tolerant plants. The nurseries are going to provide what the market asks for.
Sure.
And if that's things like azaleas and pansies, then they're going to carry azaleas and pansies. If it means sodding with fescue grass because that's what people want, then they're going to carry fescue grasses. But those are all very water inefficient plants for the desert.
Well, Winn, I certainly want to thank you for showing us around the gardens today and telling us a lot about desert plants and water and some of the problems we face in the future. And hopefully our viewers will take some of the tips that you've given us seriously, and we can all work together and solve some of the water problems in our area. Thank you for being on our show today.
Appreciate you being here. I hope all your viewers will come and visit the gardens. We're open 7 days a week, and there's no charge.
That's great. Thanks again. And thank all of you as well for joining us today on Along the Rio Grande.